To actually design your suspension geometry. That's what we're going to be looking at today in our er8 the tech series. We're at episode 8 now. I originally had the electronics planned for episode 8, but yeah, you guys were commenting so much from the suspension episode that you wanted about the some explanations about the actual geometry stuff. Also, of course, suspension and suspension geometry are two somewhat related but completely separate topics, so these are split into two pieces. And then that's why, in suspension you go through the suspension, and in suspension geometry you look at the geometry setup, and they have completely different tasks and setups and stuff like that. So the suspension is, of course, you guys saw the last episode, so that's about the suspension travel and how to keep the ride height correct, and roll stuff and all that kind of stuff, and working out the best solution for whatever racing it is that you do, or just street use, of course, also. So in suspension geometry, the task of that is to keep the tires at an optimum angle to get the maximum possible traction. So if you're going in a straight line, of course, optimum traction for that, or in whatever type of racing you're doing, how to optimize that. And of course, also not just keeping the tire at the correct angle, but also keeping the tire movement, or more accurately, the tire contact patch movement in relation to your vehicle chassis, as accurate as possible. And so if we traditionally look at that, this is something that people use these roll center things and stuff like that to figure out, and that's just that's not what we use here at Elmer Racing. Let's just say that. So if you calculate your roll center, and that would be, I'm actually not sure what sort of values are used these days. It's been quite a few years since I've used this technique. So if you have a roll center of whatever 40 millimeters or something, then what does that really tell you about your suspension setup? Not much, maybe something, but so let's look into how actually to do these things. Let's look at this. So this is the rear suspension. Let me just pop up the front suspension here quickly for you guys. So this is a little bit more descriptive. So you can't just view your suspension geometry as a one number value, or a combination of 2 or 3 different one number values. That is just doesn't provide nearly enough information to be able to know that your suspension is actually going to work. So this is basically the minimum amount of information you can possibly get away with, because you have 6 degrees of freedom for your suspension, and each of those is dependent both on the bump and steering for your steered wheels, which on most cars will be the front wheels, of course, but on 4 wheels on some cars also. And this is as compact of an information setup as you can get. So let me explain how this works. So here we have the camber angle. That's of course really important for cornering and straight line performance. Also, you have some optimum camber angle, which in a straight line would probably be 0, but depending on the tire setup, it might be non-zero. Anyway. So we have a bump on one axis and steering on the other axis, and then we have this 2D shape here on how the camber angle changes. So we have the camber angle here on the, if this is X and Y, then this would be Z axis. I'm not sure actually what the axis names are here. So then we get this curved surface here, and so in relation to bump, you can see that, when our bump moves here from 0 to 20 millimeters, for instance, we're gaining about 1 degree of camber or something like that. So and you need to have this complete map over the whole suspension area. So each suspension suspension travel and steering angle, so that you can see that your suspension system is going to work over the whole area, not just at one specific point, because that's just completely pointless, and you see lots of problems with cars being set up to work at one point, but then in some corners they don't work. And why is that? Well, it's because the suspension geometry is completely wrong. So in like tighter turning radius where you need more steering input, then your suspension is going to work at all, and going to have big problems with setting up your vehicle. Yeah, so this is a 1 degree of freedom, camber angle. Then we have a vertical movement. So this is of course a link to the suspension travel, but it kind of depends a little bit on what kind of a geometry you have for your you can have pull rod, push rod suspension, or in a MacPherson setup you of course have some kind of an angle there because of the interlink from your steering from your other steering steering angles, so suspension geometry setup. And of course, so this works with, regardless of what type of suspension setup you have. So if you have a MacPherson setup, or upper lower A arms, or a multi-link setup, semi-trailing arm, trailing arm, whatever you want, this works regardless of what suspension setup you have. Because this is like, so this setup shows what your wheel is actually doing. So it doesn't care about, like, at all about what the, how that wheel is moving or why it's moving. That does not affect your vehicle or your chassis function at all, or how the tire moves or anything like that. That it doesn't matter like how you accomplish it. If your geometry is the same, then that influences the physical forces you have from your tire to your chassis, and that's the only thing that matters. So this is completely independent of any type of suspension. You can, if you get a suspension setup, whatever it is, if the curves look good, it's going to work, as long as of course you don't have structural limits. So some suspension components starts flexing too much and you're not taking that into consideration in your calculations, of course. But yeah, let's get back to this. So yeah, vertical movement here. We have a, I believe, pull rod setup maybe planned for the front of our er8. Wait, pull rod, push rod. Yeah, so the back is going to have a push rod, so the front has a pull rod. Yeah. So yeah, we have the bump and steering here, and the vertical movement of the. So this is the all on the contact patch, of course, and not like center of the wheel or something like that, because that is again completely irrelevant to how the car actually works. Of course, you have some inertial forces due to the rotation stuff and things like that, but for most cases those will be really small in a car setup anyway, so that's not anything we take into consideration at the moment. But yeah, so with this you can potentially adjust in some bump steer or something like that. So depending on if you have some interlink between the steering and the vertical motion here. That's not bump steer per se, but part of it. So this is, for instance, if you want centering sort of a force on the vehicle done by the suspension compression. So this is something that, for instance, in karting is used very heavily to influence a vehicle chassis setup. And that would be this part. In our case, that's not something we want, because the suspension loading is so high that you would have an incredible amount of force on the steering wheel due to that. So we try to tune that very small, but we do have a slight angle there to provide a little bit of a sort of suspension compression sort of steering feedback for that. And then we have a sideways motion. This is really important for anti-roll stuff. So depending on how much bump you have, you really want to have a relatively flat, or depending on, again, on your suspension. I mean, you need to figure this out for whatever racing you're doing. If you're doing like oval racing or something, you might want to have some kind of a tilt here, or probably do want to have that to either reduce or increase roll depending on what kind of racing you're doing. But for specifically for cornering in one direction, of course, you would want the right and the left wheel set up completely differently, and this, of course, works for that also. Of course, then you would need to do one for your right wheel and one for your left wheel for both front and rear. But yeah, in a symmetrical setup, this basically is just mirrored for the other wheel. So on our steering input here, we have a clear sort of angle set up here. This is to get feedback to the steering wheel from what kind of a G loading you have on the tires, and that is well, depending on, I mean, good drivers may be a kind of a difficult term to say, but But for instance, from karting racing, I take relatively little feedback from the actual steering into consideration in like how to maneuver the car around the corners. It's more about what the sort of car rotation and what the chassis is doing that is more important. But of course, it always helps, and you don't want to set up a suspension system to not be optimal. So having force feedback from the sort of amount of g-forces you're pulling in the corner is helpful for figuring out if you're coming over a patch of tarmac that is slightly slippier or something. Then you immediately feel that in the steering wheel, and that of course is useful always. And if you're coming over a dip or something, or a dip would be, well, whichever direction a dip would be. So if you're going over a crest or something like that, and the steering offloads a little bit and you don't have as much side force anymore, you'll immediately feel that in the steering wheel. So that is important for feedback. Then we have the toe input. So that's basically the steering angle on that and how the bump and steering input. So of course you want steering input to affect what kind of angle you have on the wheels. So of course you have a high degree of interlock between the steering and the toe angle, and so this is of course also bump steering. So all of these are more or less interlinked depending on the suspension setup. So you move around like one component, and that will affect all of these. So then you need to move around other components to compensate for that, to get the optimal shape for all, or the optimum compromise for all of these 6 different curves, of course. But yeah, this is the curve we're going with now on our er8, and of course a lot of these will look completely differently if you're running a passive suspension system. So with active ride height control that we have on our er8, the optimum sort of shapes we want for a lot of these curves are completely different. So don't just try to copy these, that won't work. Unless you copy the suspension system, of course, also then these would be, I think, a good starting point. And so caster angle, this is, depending on your suspension and brake setup, either has some kind of influence or virtually no influence at all. So if you have a brake setup like inboard brakes or something like that you don't have feedback between the brake caliper and your upright hub or something like that, then this will have virtually zero influence on anything. It's just all of the rest of these that are influential in that case. But for outboard brakes that we are running at the front on our er8, like you typically have on cars, and then this caster angle gets important because you have with this caster angle change in relation to a bump, you basically get anti-dive geometry, or you can like do pro dive if you do the geometry the other way. So because of the brake caliper clamping down on the disc, that creates a rotational force, and that rotational force sort of around the sideways axis of the car that wants to rotate the hub. If you have a connection between that caster angle and the bump, then you can basically get anti-dive geometry, so that when you apply the brakes, the front suspension wants to rise up, so that basically gives you some anti-dive, and you can of course tune how much that works in relation to your vehicle setup. And this is of course something that needs to be done with a dynamic simulation to figure everything out on how this works together, so that you don't end up with resonance problems or all kinds of stuff. Like if you're bottoming out the suspension, either going too low or too high or something like that, then you can have big problems. So this is definitely something that needs to be done with the full dynamic suspension. Of course, this is something we went through in a previous episode also, so go back and check out to review on why running full dynamic simulations is very important. And of course, last but not least, we have longitudinal motion also. So this is like the pair to sideways motion. So sideways motion is like how much the contact patch. So if you have, do I have anything round here? Well, not really. Okay, but anyway, so if you have a tire that is rotating in this direction and you have the contact patch, if that is moving sideways in relation to steering and bump, then that's of course like anti-roll geometry. And the longitudinal motion is the other direction, so how much that contact patch moves forward and rearward during both bump and steering. So again, with steering input, we don't want much longitudinal motion, because that again introduces forces into the steering. We want some kind of feedback, because if you're locking up a wheel, for instance, during braking, then you want to be able to feel that in the steering. So we have tuned in a little bit of steering feedback for the longitudinal motion, and well, actually, yeah, significant amount of that, and bump a little bit into the suspension geometry there, but not too much. So this is again something you can use for anti-dive, but you need to be careful with this, of course, also, like how big of a wheel arch you need and how much sort of wheel travel you can tolerate. So for us, the wheel arch movement, we don't want, because we're going to be racing the car with multiple different size tires. So the bigger tires, or the big, like, slick tires, the LMP1 size tires that we're going to be racing, we don't want to have like any extra space in the wheel well at all, because when we run smaller tires, there's going to be a large gap there. So like running a extra large gap for the smaller tires is just really bad. So want to keep that as small as possible. And of course, tuning this caster angle gets us the anti-dive we want already, so we don't really need to apply this longitudinal motion. But you can use that also, definitely, depending on your suspension geometry and setup. And so now you guys basically know how to do that, and your next question is going to be, so how do we get these like graphs? So there are multiple ways to do this. The easiest way by far is definitely to use optimization algorithms. So you just input your suspension geometry points and then run an optimization algorithm to figure out the location or the angle for the upright, and from that where the contact patch on the tire is, how that is moving around, so you can get all these graphs out. But of course you can solve these what is it called, so numerically, of course, also, and get these with a much lower CPU overhead. So for our er8, we're running upper and lower A-arms in the front and semi-trailing arm in the rear, so we basically can run the same solver for both front and rear, and we've done some simplifications for that. So just quickly show you that over here. So it's not too bad. We have some documentation here, because when you come back to something like this, like 2 weeks after you've done it, then you have no clue anymore. So document everything, guys. That's a freebie. We input the data. We basically calculate the lower A-arm height. That's basically this bump input here. So the bump input is not directly like the contact patch movement, but close to that. But that's why this vertical movement and bump is also important to calculate. But we also incorporate the pull rod angle to figure this out. So that's important to do. And basically from that, it's very easy to just calculate the next piece and the next piece and the next piece. And and when we have all the values, these are our plot stuff here. So we're using Octave for this, and very usable open source tool that is really good and efficient. And if you run this on a non sort of a cutting edge Linux layout, then you can rotate these around and view these from different angles. If I try to do this on this system, it crashes, so that's not good. But if you run a more mainstream setup that uses older kernels and has suspension, but software packages that are known to work together and graphics drivers that work with Qt stuff, then you're not going to have a problem. Or if you run Windows, then this works also fine on our Windows setup. So that's not a problem. I think that was pretty much it. So that's how we do it here. I guess this would be called the Elmer Method or something like that, because I haven't seen anyone do this before. But if you want to actually calculate suspension geometry and do that based on physical aspects, so how much the contact patch moves sideways, how much vertical movement you have, what is your camber angle, how is your toe varying to these, then this is the minimum amount of data you can get away with, and it's very easy to use and visualize. So I don't see any reason to use any kind of these antiquated roll center things and these moment arm calculations and stuff like this. No, these are the physical aspect. These are directly related to what physical forces you have on the vehicle. Of course, tire flex and stuff like this needs to be taken into consideration also. So you need to think about that when you're setting up these curves so that you get a good initial guess. But once you have that, you input it into your full dynamic simulation software and run it from there and see how it feels, how it works, and tune these a little bit. But yeah, once you use this, it's so easy to set things up. I think we've run maybe like 3 or 4 iterations only on the suspension geometry setup to get this to work. So it's incredibly efficient and saves so much time. So yeah. I'm expecting you guys to everyone move over to this, dubbing it the Elmer Method or whatever, but yeah, if you're not using this, you're just like, no. Use this method. It's by far the best and way easiest and saves you so much time. So do that, guys. Is there anything I'm forgetting? Let me jump back here quickly. No, not really. I think electronics will be up next, I think, and probably we'll be doing a sort of short episode, or short maybe 4 or 5 episodes on the Thor engine. I got so many questions and feedback from that on my Facebook and yeah, on our Elmer Racing YouTube page comment also. So yeah, keep the comments coming, and yeah, tell me what you guys want to know, so we can go through that and explain how we do things and why we do things, so that you guys can make yeah, informed decisions on what is the best solutions for you guys. But yeah, I'm Oskar from Elmer Racing. This has been er8 the Tech Series, episode 8 on suspension geometry. See you guys in the next one. Bye.